It's only really in the second term that he has gotten much more aggressive about making a move on Greenland, whereas I think in the first term it was something they talked about, but you didn't have this kind of feeling that the administration was moving as a matter of policy on trying to acquire Greenland. And that's exactly what the Danes will tell you. I mean, and when I talk to them, when I talk to them about this, they say, look, what we have told the Trump administration over and over again, and they've told members of Congress this, including Republicans, where they're trying to really get the message across, is if you want to build more bases, great. And I have to say, I know a lot of people in the administration will say, no, the president knows that he doesn't want to end those alliances. I'm not at all persuaded of that.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. Shane Harris is with us again to discuss his most recent piece for The Atlantic. In it, he and his colleagues lay out how an idea that once sounded like a punchline, the United States acquiring Greenland, either by force or fiat, is now being treated by both U.S. and European officials as a very real contingency, especially after the recent capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. We're going to talk about how this idea took shape, why Europe is taking it quite seriously now, and what it would mean for NATO if the United States moved unilaterally against an ally's territory, and how much meaningful resistance to this idea exists in Washington. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Shane Harris, welcome back on Secrets and Spies. It's good to have you, as always.
Matt, thank you. It's good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Sure. How's your 2026 been?
Well, it's off with a bang, Matt.
Yeah, a few bangs.
I was kind of expecting we might just ease into it a little bit. I don't know why I thought such foolish thoughts, but we did not ease into it.
Yeah, just give me a week to answer some emails, to sort of get my wits about me first before we start doing all this stuff. But
it was like one of those holidays where we had the buffer weekends on each side. So I will say, the president did very kindly, wait until after that period to go, attack a sovereign country and do other things. But so
bombing Nigeria at that time.
I guess he did do that on a weekend though, so I didn't really get the weekend.
Yeah, no. Anywho, so we're going to talk about some of the fallout from that Venezuela operation, or at least what the Venezuela operation pushed back to the forefront. Right. So your latest in The Atlantic with your colleagues Isaac Stanley Becker and Jonathan Lemire looks at the renewed fantasizing, it's a little bit more than fantasizing, I think, at this point, seizure of Greenland by the United States against the objections of pretty much everybody. And this may be a little bit editorializing by me. But I don't know. I don't work for CBS, so whatever. I find this particular thing to be probably, personally at least, the most sort of enraging aspect of the second term. And everyone probably has their own. This is mine, just because in terms of what I do and what I focus on, I just find it particularly dumb and self-destructive and just a vile way to treat a committed small d democratic Western ally. So that's where I'm coming at with this. So for listeners, full disclosure there.
Yeah.
I think part of sort of where I wanted to start also with this is this idea is one of those things that if you said this a year ago or a year and a half ago, maybe in Trump's second term, he's going to try and, threaten to seize Greenland by force, you would have been mocked and called hysterical, and that's ridiculous and everything. Yeah. Nevertheless, here we are. So I wanted to maybe look at that a bit closely. In your reporting, in your conversations, where did this idea come from that we need Greenland, quote unquote, need Greenland?
Well, that's a really good question. And if you go back to sort of like the origins of this, there are I have talked to people who will say that there are people in Donald Trump's orbit, let's just say, and I'm thinking of like one or two specific people who I don't want to name them right now because I have never gone to some of these individuals and asked them,
Hmm.
did you once tell Donald Trump that Greenland was strategically important and put this bug in his ear? But there are some kind of people who, let's just say, I think he knew from his sort of circle of rich, famous people who have put this bug in his ear going back even to the first term. So, he talked about it in the first term. This is not something that's a novel kind of fixation since the reelection. Um, but suffice to say that there are, both people who he knows from social circles who have talked about Greenland as a country with great natural resources, mineral wealth, rare earths, and who have talked about it as being a strategic position against Russia and China. And he has got this idea in his mind. Now, it's not that those things aren't true. I mean, it is a country with great mineral wealth. It's very hard to get out of the ground, and we can talk about that.
Strategically important to the United States,
Yeah,
too,
and
also.
it is
Yeah.
strategically important. I mean, you can debate about the importance he's attaching to it, and there will be people who will debate of whether he'll say, it's surrounded by Russian and Chinese submarines. I mean, there are people who debate whether that's true as well. But sure, I mean, strategically important. I mean, yes. I mean, for one thing, we do have a base, on Greenland right now. It's essentially a missile early warning base. But during the Cold War, we had about 17 bases. So obviously, there was a period in relatively recent history where the United States regarded Greenland as important. But what I think is also pressing on Trump is there are people who are close to the White House in sort of in the realm of what you might call broadly concerned about Arctic security. One name that has come up is a guy named Tom Dans, who is somebody who is close to the president. His brother was involved in the Project 2025 effort. And Dans has served on, and now serves again on an Arctic commission, who is somebody who has talked to people in the White House about this, is kind of like, has a very public position on the necessity of Greenland for U.S. security, so that he's a pretty visible figure in all of this. And then there are also people who are sort of kind of in the techno-libertarian community who like have visions of Greenland as some kind of new free state.
Bunch of data centers.
Well, data centers, or could you do like space research on Greenland? And I mean,
Yeah.
it gets kind of, far afield from hard national security interests. But there are people just within Trump's orbit that think about this, that have thought about it for a long time, and that either, I wouldn't say have his ear, because I'm not really sure anyone has his ear, but can get these messages to him and have kind of elevated this as a priority. And it's only really in the second term that he has gotten much more aggressive about making a move on Greenland. Whereas I think in the first term it was something they talked about, but you didn't have this kind of feeling that the administration was moving as a matter of policy on trying to acquire Greenland.
It always has rung to me the sort of thing that you brought up the first term. It's always rung to me the sort of thing that if this came up in the first term, seriously, like in a National Security Council meeting or something, and Trump says we need to own Greenland, like it has to be a U.S. protectorate, like we need ownership of Greenland. It seems like the kind of thing that John Kelly or Jim Mattis would have said, "Sir, yes, sir, that's a great idea," and then gone to Denmark and say, "Hey, we would like to increase U.S. Space Force's presence in Greenland, perhaps some sort of a rotational force in partnership with other NATO allied members. How can we get this done?" And those people now just aren't there, and there's no one to say that's insane.
I think that's generally right. I mean, and that's exactly what the Danes will tell you. I mean, and when I talk to them, when I talk to them about this, they say, "Look, what we have told the Trump administration over and over again, and they've told members of Congress this, including Republicans, where they're trying to really get the message across, is if you want to build more bases, great. We're happy to have you do it. We have a longstanding security agreement with the United States that is very much under the terms of the deal that you can do that. If you want there to be more joint NATO presence around Greenland as a buffer against China and Russia, by all means, let's do it. And, and you're seeing European troops, I think, in the process of maybe going to Greenland now as a kind of way of demonstrating that that NATO is serious, or these member countries are serious about committing to Greenland's defense. If you want to do more minerals extraction, we can talk about that too. It's actually harder to do than people think it is. I think that Denmark would have done a lot more of it if it were really trivially easy. But absolutely, I mean, if he really wanted to do this and was onto this, I think would expect, an administration that was interested in, preserving NATO and in treating our allies well would go to our allies and say, hey, the president feels strongly about this. We feel strongly. We need to talk. We need to change things. And they would do it. And that, again, the Trump administration not only knows that, but that is what Danish officials tell them all the time when they meet with them on this. And what you hear the president saying is, no, control. We need control. We need ownership. And he talks about it he talks about it recently like, the difference between owning and renting your home, right? If you own it, you can do whatever you want to it. But if you're renting it, it's really somebody else's. And he speaks about it with those terms of ownership. So, your rational approach, which is the one the Danes favor, is obviously not the one that the president favors.
I was wondering if you could describe also the sort of the nature of the basing agreement that we have with Denmark, which was originally, to my understanding of it, was signed during World War II. The Danish ambassador was cut off from the Danish government in exile here in the U.S. But it's essentially as close to an agreement of you can do whatever you want up there as we have. We have quite free reign up there.
Yes, it's a lot of latitude. And again, that's something that when I've talked to Danish officials, they say, you can basically do whatever you want with regards to that. So, it essentially would allow us that if what Trump wanted to do was start building more bases on Greenland and housing U.S. forces there, somebody will correct me if I got this wrong, but essentially that does not have to go through a kind of formal process of approval, I don't think.
With Denmark?
With Denmark, the way it would, say, if we wanted to open a base in the UK. That we just have a lot more latitude to do this, which I think is kind of maybe part of where I come back again to this kind of Trump's insistence that ownership is the thing that we want. We want control of the territory. For him, it's not enough to just, and I think that has to do more with mineral rights and with the fact that he wants to physically expand the size of the United States. And less to do with we feel like we're not given favorable enough terms or enough latitude to build bases, because the security agreement, I mean, it's exactly like you say it is. We can go build these things. We don't really need Denmark's permission to do that so much.
Donald Trump Jr. had a trip to Greenland last year that they tried to sort of play up as a goodwill sort of mission. I was wondering if you could also talk through how that was received in Greenland itself and in Denmark, because Greenland's also had a pretty nascent independence movement for a while.
Yeah, I mean, look, Greenlanders, I mean, I think broadly a lot of Greenlanders favor independence for Greenland. Now, I think, and I don't mean that to say they're all ready to jump on board with the United States or someone else, but, I think that for a lot of them, they feel that Greenland has a distinct culture, it has a distinct language, it has a heritage and a history. Yes, it obviously has a history with Denmark, but and I say a lot of Greenlanders, it's a country of about 56,000 people. So we're talking about a country that is the size of a small city. But I think for a lot of Greenlanders have a very fraught relationship with Denmark, and will view it, and some will say this, kind of view it as a kind of a colonialist power. So I don't want to say if there are gradations of this, but yes, I mean, Greenland has expressed in documents, in essentially official communications publicly, a desire for independence. And it does have a kind of semi-autonomous status. When Donald Trump Jr. went there in January, and he flew in on his father's plane, and he went with Charlie Kirk, actually.
Forgot that, yeah.
Yeah. I think it was seen as kind of like MAGA and MAGA influencers are coming to Greenland, and there is like this one guy who is sort of Mr. MAGA. He's a guy named Jorgen Bosen in Nuuk, and it was just the capital of Greenland, who is like, and he helped Charlie. He became friends with Charlie when he was still alive, and he helped him organize the trip. And I think that Trump Jr. and those folks were kind of seeing this as like, we're going to go. This is not shortly before the inauguration, and kind of get things kickstarted. And what I've heard from people is that it did not go well. It was sort of a carnival atmosphere and a spectacle because, Trump Force One was on the ground and, in this tiny airport. Well, not a tiny airport. It's actually, I think, quite large. But the impression of a lot of people in Greenland was that Trump Jr. was there throwing his weight around. There was a rumor that spread, which I think was probably not true, that he was handing out $100 bills to homeless people. Now, he did take a group of homeless men to lunch at apparently a fairly good restaurant, but it was kind of seen as like, this guy is coming in here throwing money around literally, and who does he think he is? And from talking to, people both in Greenland and talking to people in Copenhagen, you could see that there was a kind of rising hostility, might not be too strong of a word, towards this idea of American acquisition of Greenland after that trip, to the point where, when the vice president and his wife, Usha Vance, were supposed to go over on a later trip, Danish officials didn't want them to go because they were really worried about security disruptions and they were worried about protests. And so if you remember on that trip, they were supposed to, or I think Usha at least was supposed to go to a dog sledding event, I think, and that was canceled. Her attendance was canceled.
She was originally supposed to go alone, as I
Yeah.
recall, and then
Yeah, and from people I've talked to, there were genuine concerns about her security. Again, not that I think there was like a physical threat to the second lady, but more, if you get there and there are tons of protests and people start surrounding your car, things are going to escalate. Like, can we not do this?
optics are bad.
And so it ended up that, that the VP's visit was up to the space base in the northwest of the country. So, it hasn't been going well, these efforts, to try and drum up support. And, in the latest, sort of pushback a couple of months ago, the Danish intelligence service, according to reporting there by their public broadcaster in Denmark, essentially said that they believe the U.S. is running an intelligence or an influence operation on the ground in Denmark, which my understanding is that consists of allies of President Trump trying to go around and basically gin up support for their idea. Maybe not all that different than what Donald Trump Jr. thought he was doing by going on the ground there. And you can see from public reporting and from other sources that like it doesn't seem like there's a groundswell of support for this idea. And I think that a number of Greenlanders clearly find it quite offensive that, the Trump administration feels like it can sort of waltz into Greenland and just take it or buy it.
Let's take a break and we'll be right back. Earlier in the year, after these visits by Don Jr. and the vice president, there was a story that came out very very early on in the term that I believe it was the DNI's office, the Director of National Intelligence,
Yeah.
had instructed, and I think you're sort of getting to this in a bit with what Danish intelligence was concluding, had instructed, I'm guessing the CIA, to draw up covert action plans, political influence plans to try to, as you were saying, bolster the Greenlandic independence movement or that sort of push to drive them away from Denmark. And I think one of the most interesting things about that story is that it leaked immediately. And, you've been covering the intelligence community for many years. You have insight into it like, few else on the outside. That to me was a signal of that it leaked immediately was a signal of how it would have been received when that order came down within the community. Have you heard anything about that?
I will say that people I talk to, think that the notion that we're going to simply annex Greenland, people in the intelligence community, is not a great idea, and don't think that ramping up this kind of intelligence collection on a NATO ally is not something that they think is particularly the kind of thing that we should be doing.
Hmm.
I think there's a question in my mind about how sophisticated this really is. Um, you know, the way it was reported in Danish circles, because there was a Wall Street Journal report that Tulsi Gabbard had sort of ordered up more collection on Greenland, and that was like, well, what do we mean by collection? Like, what is that looking like? And then there have been other reporting to the effect of on the ground trying to kind of result in influence operations, help the Greenlandic independence movement, as you say. Again, it's a country of 56,000 people, and what's funny is when I talk to sources in Copenhagen about this, I'll say like, "Well, what do you make of this, kind of covert influence campaign that people have been describing?" And they kinda laugh and they roll their eyes. You're like, it's a small country, like, when people from the outside show up and start, banging around, we kind of notice. Like, they know
Yeah.
who these people are that are on the ground, and some of them are, look, Jorgen Bosen is a name I mentioned earlier as somebody who is there in Nuuk and is very outspoken in favor of Greenlandic independence and joining the United States. Like, this doesn't have the feeling to me of like a cloak and dagger operation. I think this is, a little bit more people trying to see if they can soften the ground a little bit to figure out, would Greenlanders be open to essentially a monetary offer from the United States? And, my colleagues and I have done some reporting on this earlier in the year that, officials in the Trump administration were sort of doing back of the envelope math of like, okay, well, how much money would it take like for us to actually put on the table to give Greenlanders to say, we're essentially buying the country? And by buying, I mean, it could mean, for instance, like, do they become a territory? Do they do something like join in what's called a compact of free association, which we've offered to some, territories and small islands? Some legal mechanism that, they would agree to enter into. And yes, it would take some, acts maybe by the Danish government, by the Greenlandic government, but is there essentially a price, right? And the Trump administration's view on this probably is everyone has a price. Um, and how do you put that on the table? And like when I've pressed people who are involved in this effort on this
Yeah.
and said, what Greenlanders in the government there and what people in Copenhagen will say is, we are not for sale. And the Trump allies' response to that will be, but they haven't yet heard the offer. And Trump, I mean, for all he's talking about, we might use military force, we could do this the easy way or the hard way. I do think he would rather go the easy way. And the easy way in his mind is what check would the US government have to write per Greenlander to make them say yes? And so I think that some of this kind of influence campaign is geared towards this idea of trying to bring people around to this idea. I'm not sure it's working. In fact, I think it's probably backfiring pretty spectacularly.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, you mentioned the cloak and dagger thing and that it's not that. I think people in the administration would very much like to create that. The problem is there isn't enough people in the country to be receptive to that, And as you said, it's a country of what, 57,000 people. If a guy from Virginia shows up with a Vienna in hat walking around passing out cash, that gets you can't hide that.
Or a private citizen. Like, I mean, there are people who have gone to Greenland who are allied with the
Yeah.
Trump administration. Like, I mean, they're just known. Like Tom Dans is another person I've mentioned who is known in this whole mix.
Can you tell us more about Jurgen Bosen? You talk about him a little bit in your piece, but why is he so in favor of this?
It's really interesting, and I've communicated with him a couple of times. He If you didn't know he was from Greenland and you just heard him talking, you might think that he was just a typical MAGA voter. He talks a lot about um, out of touch elites. In this case, what he believes are like both, the government in Copenhagen, but also people who are Danish Greenlandic, who are maybe not like pure Greenlandic, and who are sort of like the elites as he sees them in Greenland, who don't really understand Greenlandic tradition who, are kind of like coming from outside the country. I mean, just remember too that, I mean,
Does Don Jr.? That's what I find so insane about the argument. Like he's saying, like, oh, these.
a guy like Boson, though, will look at Trump and say, like, but Trump is for the common people and he's anti-elite, right? And
Okay.
and there is like a real strain of, it's kind of interesting. It's, you know, like when I've talked to Boson, he's talked about, the United States, if you don't do something about your immigration problem, you're not going to be the same country anymore, which again, it sounds like he's channeling Trump. And it's kind of like, in his mind, I think he's also seeing wanting to make Greenland for Greenlanders and to kind of maintain a sense of their tradition and their own heritage that, is well predates an association with Denmark. I mean, for American audiences, like when you think about Greenland, like in your mind, conjure up Alaska and think about sort of native Inuit peoples and sort of, uh, 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 people who have been in Alaska, for, millennia, maybe.
Yeah, since
Right.
before it was a
This
U.S.
is
territory. Yeah.
right. Exactly. Well before.
Yeah.
We're talking about, like a deep, deep history here. This is sort of like in Greenland, where you're talking about, like, we would look at Greenlanders and be like, oh, this kind of feels like a Native American tradition sort of thing. And it is North America. I mean,
It
it is
is.
literally geographically North America. So, there's a sense of that kind of, for especially people like Jorgen Bosen, but also clearly for others too, a sense of like, what it means to be Greenlandic. And that doesn't mean being Danish. And that's different than being European. So, there's a kind of, when I talk to Bosen, I mean, he's kind of more maybe extreme in this, but again, it sounds MAGA-ish. It's like, make Greenland great again, Greenland first. And what I think is the kind of, to my mind, is the disconnect there. And I've pressed him on this, and I don't think he's given me a satisfactory answer, frankly, but you're talking about just swapping, one big power that's not Greenlandic for another big power that's not Greenlandic. To say nothing of the fact that in Greenland, they have all of the privileges of a socialized healthcare system and a huge social safety net that Danes and other Scandinavians enjoy. Like, we don't have that in this country. I mean, is that part of the check? Do they get healthcare for life and free education?
Yeah, that'd be nice. Maybe we should move up there.
Maybe we should all move to Greenland. This would be great. But there is this kind of like anti-elite, anti-outsider, nationalist kind of sentiment that you find among people like Jorgen Bosen that has its echo in the MAGA movement as well. It's a sort of populism or nationalism. It's just, I'm not persuaded. Like, I kept pressing Jorgen on this, saying like, look, the polls show that like your fellow Greenlanders just do not agree with you. Like, they may want independence, but they don't want to sell the country to the United States. And what he insists is that there is, not his words, but to this effect, a silent majority of people who are afraid of the government in Denmark taking retaliatory action against them for speaking out, who really do want this, or at very least want to be away from Denmark. So, I don't know that he's right. I mean, again, I'm not persuaded of that, but, it's not as though like the entire country of Greenland just absolutely loves Denmark either. So you can see why Trump and MAGA people would look at this and say, we get this. We see this sentiment. We understand it. We get the whole like bucking the government elite, being your own people, kind of, there's a kind of almost like nationalist or tribal identity behind it that I think that you also kind of find in a political context in this country.
This story, at least in the U.S. news cycle, went away for most of the year. It was sort of looming in the background. I think you and I, on a few episodes here, touched on it once or twice as sort of, something on the back burner to pay attention to and hope it doesn't come up again. That didn't happen. It came up again quite loudly immediately after the raid to capture Maduro. I was wondering if you could talk us through how that renewed focus, how that's been received in Europe.
I mean, with a lot of dread, I think is the answer. When I was in Copenhagen in October, And in talking to people there, officials and people sort of in the national security expert community, many of them would say, like, "Do you think Trump's forgotten about Greenland?" Because he hadn't brought it up in quite a while. And my response was, "I don't think so." Like, he doesn't forget about things. He moves on to one thing and then eventually comes back around to it. And I think this was before there had been the ceasefire in Gaza. And a number of people said, like, well, I'm worried that, once he gets his ceasefire and maybe he gets bored of trying to solve the war in Ukraine, he's going to come back around to us again.
Mhm.
And they were right. He did come back round, and I'd said, "Yes, he will." But what drove him back round again was Venezuela, not Ukraine. So, look, I don't think I've ever seen. Well, I was going to say I don't think I've ever seen European allies so concerned about the future of their alliances with the United States. But really, you can go back to, I mean, they've always had anxieties about Trump, but you can go back to J.D. Vance's speech, I think it was last February at the Munich Security Conference, as the kind of start point where it felt as if Vance was very much putting Europe on notice, like things are going to change here, and people feeling like that alliance was coming apart. Greenland would, if you don't have to take my word for it. The Danish prime minister said this, that if the United States were to try to annex Greenland by force, that's the end of NATO. So the mood in Europe right now is hugely anxious, and people are terribly upset, angry. Um, you know, um, I've talked to Danish and Greenlandic officials just in the past week about this. People get extremely emotional, like, like, um, you know, angry and frightened, I mean, is how people really feel right now. Because if he wanted to take Greenland, no one can really stop him.
You mentioned in your piece that, U.S. officials and Trump allies you spoke with downplayed the possibility of military action in Greenland. A, it's the middle of winter. B, there isn't really. I'm not sure what you would send JSOC or the 82nd Airborne up there to seize. Like there just isn't. Like I don't know how you would physically do it. Other than just showing up and just setting up camp. You
Yeah.
know. Um, However, the scenario that you also note at the top of your piece, the Trump announcing on True Social late one night, this is sort of the Danes sort of nightmare scenario, him just sort of saying, essentially, Greenland is a U.S. protectorate now, to me, I think is no less of a seizure than if JSOC or the 82nd Airborne Division were to do it. In that case, I mean, I can't. Are European NATO members discussing about invoking Article 5 against the United States? I mean, as insane as it sounds and as it would be, or should we be imagining that?
I don't know because I'm not even sure that Article 5
Yeah, like, does it?
provides for an attack by a member of the
It
treaty. I
doesn't.
mean, look, like, yeah, okay. So, like, I mean, so not Article 5 invocation. I mean, I just think it would just be the end of NATO. Like, if by force TP takes, if the United States takes Greenland, like, that's it. I mean, the alliance essentially ceases to exist. And if for no other, I mean, if for all practical purposes, obviously, but if for a legal reason, I guess it would be like one member broke the treaty. Now, I don't know what the provisions are for expelling a member of NATO. Could all the other NATO members get together and say the United States is out? I mean, I literally don't know. For all I know, there's a clause in the NATO agreement that says we can never be kicked out. But the organization would just stop at that point. Um, and one of the reasons why I kind of led in our story with this idea about Trump just announcing that it belongs to the United States is because the United States doesn't have to take it by force, right? I mean, it could, but it would break NATO. And I think Trump knows that.
Yes.
But he could just assert that it belongs to us and start operating as if it did. Now, if that happened, I think the situation becomes far muddier and murkier and weirder because, well, then what? Did the Europeans like say, no, you don't? And we say, yeah, we do. And what about the people in Greenland? And at that point, like, let's say it does belong to us. Well, one presumes, if he insists that it does, one presumes that at some point then Americans start showing up and trying to extract things from the ground. Like at some point you got to physically show up with a presence there. Um, so, and then that would potentially look like, would that be invasion? Would that be violation of sovereignty? Um, you know, the reason that so many people kind of spelled out this scenario to me when I was over there a few months ago was they were trying to get across, I think, the idea that they know that they can't resist him by force. Like there's no Danish military coming to the rescue here. Um, but also that they don't assume that Trump is going to pursue any kind of legal or formal route um, to try and create an opportunity for annexation. Like, I mean, I guess he could say, I'm calling on Denmark to allow for a referendum in Greenland on whether they want to join the United States. Um, would he wait around for that? I mean, people I talked to were not sure that he would. Um, they look at it like, would he do something crazy enough as just asserting that it belongs to him? Yeah. Or like, would he try and dig into some provision of an existing treaty or something to justify it? At some point, though, there's going to be, actual friction. There's going to be kinetic action on the ground. And that's the point where I think that if we don't keep going down this road, I just don't see how NATO survives that unless, I don't know, Denmark just plays along for a couple of years and waits for him to leave office. I mean, it sounds just like even
Oh
talking this way
God,
sounds
I
crazy.
know,
It's
I
just
know,
crazy. We sound like crazy people.
I
But like
know.
this is we're moving in a direction where these are plausible scenarios. I mean, and again, go listen to what the president said. One way or the other. He said the other day, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. He's not saying, well, we're talking to Greenland. He's saying this is going to happen. And like after 10 years of covering this guy, I can tell you, he means it when he says something. That is a true thing.
Some European officials have floated sanctioning U.S. companies if Trump does seize Greenland. Do we know how that possibility is being received by the administration or American business leaders? Would that make it, less of just a fun thing to do?
I don't know. I mean, I presume he would say, they're declaring economic war on the United States. Never mind that we're, tariffing people or tariffing other countries. So I don't know, but I have to think that, um, well, one thing I can say is that Denmark in its meetings with the administration and in its public comments repeatedly emphasizes the economic relationship between Denmark and the United States. It is actually one of their, if not their biggest, in terms of their foreign investments, I think the biggest ones they have are in the United States. And they are larger in scale than a lot of other European countries, I think.
Big in like pharmaceuticals and biotechnology and stuff like
Yeah.
Novo Nordisk and everything is a Danish company.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, and you have seen, this isn't in the economic realm, but it's more the security realm. You've seen European security officials in the past week come out publicly and their own sort of, X messages blasted at the US. Um, if you try this with Greenland, we'll just revoke all of your basing rights in all these European countries. And then you can pack up Ramstein or whatever and go home. Um, again, I mean, there are things that Europeans can do economically, militarily, that don't involve warfare, but involve making life very uncomfortable for Americans. I would have to presume that the more serious Trump gets about this, if Denmark decides it's going to start sanctioning American companies, that, those companies would try to communicate to the president that maybe you need to slow things down a little bit. But, as we've seen, time and time again, U.S. companies tend to fall in line with this administration, not oppose it.
They do. I mean, there's a lot of the threats to prosecute Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, just this week also were, met with a lot of skepticism and wait, what? Hold on. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. And interestingly, you didn't see a lot of chaotic market reaction to that, which makes me wonder if, markets and the bond markets in particular are kind of pricing in just a level of,
They don't take it seriously is what it would tell me.
general crazy that goes on in this administration. And we'll see. We'll see.
Right. Let's take a break and we'll be right back. So as we're recording tomorrow, so this meeting will have happened by the time this episode airs, but the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland are meeting with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio at the White House. Rubio's reportedly told members of Congress that Trump only wants to buy Greenland. Do we know, is there any... I guess, how do we expect that meeting to go if we can expect it in some way right now as we're sitting here? And is there some scenario by which they get a deal here?
Well, I expect the meeting will go roughly like this. The Danish officials will repeat all of their normal talking points to the United States, which we've just gone over, which is if you want more bases, we can do that. If you want mineral rights, we can do that. Greenland's not for sale. And Marco Rubio, I suspect, will say something along the lines of the president's not going to take take Greenland by force, but he feels it's important to our national security, and we need to explore some kind of option, right? And what the vice president will say, I can't say. I just think that's Secretary Rubio's position. I understand it better. But they'll basically then come out of that meeting, and there will be no solution because Greenland is not for sale. Is the position of Greenland. And it's the position of Denmark. So there will be kind of at loggerheads. So I don't know that I really expect, anything to come out of that meeting.
Okay.
One thing I will say is I think based on what I've observed, there is a disconnect between what officials like Marco Rubio are saying about the president and his intentions and what the president is saying. And I strongly suspect that disconnect has been noticed by officials in Denmark and is very worrying to them. Because you can't square these two things. Like they're saying different things, Rubio and the president. They're talking about the same outcome, but the means by which we get there, they're talking in very different ways. You hear Marco Rubio trying to dial down the talk about the hard way, as the president has put it, and the president keeps dialing up the hard way part. And it doesn't help that, Katie Miller, a former White House official who's married to Stephen Miller, a current very powerful White House official, tweets a picture of Denmark with the American flag over it with the word soon. That is not, we're going to find a way to nicely acquire you. And it was not read that way in Denmark. It was read as a threat.
I'm going to read a couple quotes here from Republican senators. So far, I believe at least 9 senators have spoken publicly against this idea. So, and these are not, moderate squish snowflakes, some of these guys. So Mitch McConnell, this is just a few. Mitch McConnell, he said, threats and intimidation by U.S. officials over American ownership of Greenland are as unseemly as they are counterproductive. John Kennedy of Louisiana, quite conservative, said, even a modestly intelligent 9th grader knows that to invade Greenland would be weapons grade stupid. He's always good for a quote. Rand Paul, says, party aside, the Constitution is clear. Congress authorizes war. That safeguard exists for a reason, even when we agree with the outcome. Jerry Moran of Kansas, the U.S. should not take over another country. That's our ally. Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the Senate Armed Services Committee chairman, says this is a topic that should be dropped, adding that the Trump administration should not antagonize NATO allies. Tom Tillis of North Carolina had a really viral speech on the Senate floor the other day, ripped Stephen Miller apart. He said he's sick of stupid and added that the, quote, amateurs who said it's a good idea should lose their jobs. That's, after 10 years of covering Trump, that kind of stuff very rarely, if ever, happens. This is a unique revolt from within the GOP. I don't know that it's enough to stop this or pour cold water on it, but it's a lot of meaningful pushback.
Yeah.
And I would imagine there's also probably a lot of really meaningful pushback to this happening inside the Pentagon as well. I don't know if you know more along those lines.
There certainly is huge reluctance about this within the U.S. national security community. I think it's safe to say over the idea that we would blow up NATO over this. It's just that just seems truly preposterous. And again, I mean, I emphasize why Marco Rubio keeps talking about this in terms of like, coming to an accommodation based on buying Greenland, which to be clear, in Greenland, they don't make a distinction. They're like, we're not for sale, so stop, right, with this talk. I think that you're right to point out that all these Republican members are, who all of them I think are pretty clearly committed to the NATO alliance and its long history, think that attacking an ally would be terrible and we shouldn't do it. I don't know that they've said we shouldn't try to buy Greenland. I mean, if Greenland came out tomorrow and suddenly took a, had a referendum and they said we're open to this, that's up to the people of Greenland. And Denmark has
That would
said
be
that.
different. Yeah.
That would be different. I think another reason those senators and other lawmakers are coming out and saying it's a terrible idea is because they know that the average Trump voter doesn't give two damns about going to war with Greenland. Like they're worried about the price of groceries. They are worried about inflation. And consistently what you were hearing in polls and from people, in the president's circle and from political talking heads is that he is so focused in this term on foreign policy and foreign affairs and what look increasingly like foreign entanglements that he promised not to get involved in. And they don't think he's paying enough attention to core economic issues. And Republicans know they are hugely vulnerable on that. They're staring at a midterm election in 11 months in which they're predicted to lose the House.
They're going to lose. Yeah.
They're going to lose probably. And so they know that like when Trump is out there spending this time whipping people up about Greenland, what do American voters really care about that? Did Republicans vote Donald Trump into office to go to war with a European country? I don't think they voted for that. And I think they've pretty clearly told him that. And you hear a lot of frustration from the president's allies, even that he is not paying enough attention to the domestic concerns and primarily the economic ones that got him reelected. And this Greenland business, in addition to, I think as those senators are reflecting, seeming like so contrary to American interests for decades and not who we are just a gigantic distraction.
Yeah. It's just, I guess what just so, I don't know, drives me so nuts about this whole thing is that I said this on a few social media platforms earlier in the week that if we do acquire Greenland, either by force or some sort of other coercion otherwise, I mean, it would be a strategic imperative to the United States because it would be the farthest east that will be able to project power for a century. I mean, if you think like any intervention in the Middle East would be impossible without European bases, without that sort of logistical tail and that infrastructure, that ability to place assets so much closer to these areas of operations. I just don't, just this makes no sense. This is just the most strategically idiotic thing I've seen in my lifetime. And I faked being sick for a week from the 7th grade to sit and watch the invasion of Iraq. And this is far dumber than that. And I just can't. And I know there's plenty of people listening here who can't wrap their head around it too. It's just so, I can't fathom another scenario short of unilaterally taking out the football and just pressing buttons that you wouldn't just walk into the Oval Office and just take the keys away from the guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Again, when I've talked, to European officials, I mean, their level of frustration and kind of bafflement, it's about where yours is right now, because it doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't.
Because, again, to kind of come back to where we were in the beginning, if this were only about security, we can build bases. If it were about strengthening the NATO alliance against Russia and China in the Arctic, we have NATO. It was made for these kinds of things. I mean, I was joking with a friend today. I was like, wow, if only there were an 80-year-old alliance led by multiple nuclear powers with a long history of intelligence sharing, it's like that could go protect this territory of one of its members. This isn't about, look, I think that you can't really read into anyone's brain, and trying to read into Trump's mind, is impossible. But um, he knows that he could have the bases. It's not about the security. He knows he could have the minerals or get cut in with deals on it if we want to invest in it. It's not about the minerals. He has said it. It's about ownership. He wants to expand the physical territory of the United States. That is the only rational explanation that I can come up with for why he insists on doing this is he wants the land. He wants to be able to say, I made America greater in physical area. I think he looks at a map, sees this huge piece of land attached to North America, which, on a Mercator map will look much bigger than it actually is, but it is big. It's a quarter the size of the continental United States, and says, that's North America. Why the hell does that belong to tiny Denmark? And who are they and what are they doing for it? And I think that he that is the only thing that makes any sense to me. I mean, he always says, oh, we have to have it for the strategic purposes. We kind of do have it if we want it.
We do. Yeah.
I mean, and it's not as if, and again, but I keep coming back. So I keep going back with always the Trump. Listen to what he says, because he means what he says, is that ownership is the thing for him. He has used those words as opposed to, just being able to build bases. And when I've talked to people in Denmark and in Greenland about this, that is their view, is that this is a kind of manifest destiny idea for him, that he views his time in this second term, in this kind of expansionist 19th century kind of model, expanding the realm maybe might be more one way to put it for him because he has such imperial instincts. But I really do think that's what it's about, and I mean, I think that he would look at it and say, as long as we own it, we can do whatever we want with it. And, maybe we'll put one or two more bases up there. But the important thing for him is that he owns it. Again, there were more than a dozen, I think 17 bases in the Cold War that the United States had there. There's a long history of us having our military on Greenland. We could easily do that again. I mean, not easily. It would be a cost. But you know what I mean?
Could be
That's
done.
doable. That's very doable. And the Danes would be, I think, would actually not be opposed to that, perhaps, because I think they too think there is a reasonable argument for increasing security of and Greenland defenses on Greenland as a hedge against China and Russia, for sure. Like you can make that case. But Trump, he's in this. He is acquisitive by nature. This is what this man does, as he acquires things, and I think that he wants to expand the size of the United States that way. I mean, the thing that it's interesting, I don't hear from the MAGA base, and maybe people in MAGA feel this way, and we just haven't asked them or they haven't found a way to express it. But it's like, in taking on this extra territory, I mean, you're also taking on its citizens potentially, the care for those people, now land that you have to defend. It's not as though you're just sort of acquiring a cost-free asset here. But he's not. He's looking at, I think, Greenland the way he thinks about Venezuela, which is like, it'll all be great. It'll pay off. It's a huge asset, and it's not thinking about, for instance, the huge amounts of investment you'd have to commit to Greenland to getting those critical minerals and those natural resources out of the ground. I'm not sure that you can refine them in Greenland. I mean, it's the Arctic Circle in some of these places.
There's nothing
right?
up there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there are power facilities up there to necessarily, I think, to do anything with. It's a hugely forbidding place. I mean, it's not quite like being on the surface of the moon, but I mean, it's out there, right? And I don't know that he's thinking through, just how huge of an investment that would be. I think he looks at the map and says, I want to see that as part of the United States. And that's his legacy. I mean, I really do think for him, it's essentially that simple. And that he is underestimating the economic and the political costs of acquiring it.
His legacy from acquiring it would be the destruction of the alliance system that has made us a global superpower.
Yeah.
We would be a regional power at best.
And I have to say, I know a lot of people in the administration will say, no, the president knows that he doesn't want to end those alliances. I'm not at all persuaded of that. I mean, I don't know what they're talking about. I think, John Bolton has said, I think publicly, he'd be happy ending NATO. He is obviously not a fan of NATO. I don't see why anyone should think that the end of the NATO alliance is a red line for Trump. I think it would be for Rubio, and maybe
Definitely for
others in the
Rubio.
cabinet. But for Trump, I don't think so. I think he believes that we would be, that we could move on. And I think that he also just, again, now I'm just psychoanalyzing, but he acts like somebody who thinks that the Europeans will never actually do it. Oh, they'd never actually leave because they need us too much.
I think that too. I think he feels that the Europeans are bluffing and that he would do this and they would just sort of take it and equivocate and okay, they would, find a way to get on afterwards. And I think that is a horrible mistake to be making here.
It's also, I think, for a lot of people Danes I've talked to, it's why they fear the scenario that I outlined in the story, where it's like he tries to take it by tweet or by Truth Social post, because suddenly it creates all this ambiguity. And then maybe some NATO members say, this is outrageous. The alliance is dead. And then some say, well, hold on, let's try and figure something out. And then everyone's kind of splintered and there's chaos and division. And that could suit the purposes that he's up to very well if what he's trying to do is weaken the alliance and get people to eventually fall in line. And that is one kind of knock-on effect of this scenario that people I talked to were afraid of, is that that the other NATO members would not stand together against this, that some would try to find some way to accommodate him, with the ultimate goal being keeping the alliance together, or at least not compelling Trump to use military force.
I don't want to keep you too much longer here. Anything else here that we should cover that we haven't gotten to yet today?
No, I mean, I think it's sufficiently grim.
It is.
One thing I just want to communicate, to listeners is like I try really very hard in my coverage never to be alarmist, because I don't want to convey to you, that something is an 8 on the scale when it's really a 4, because I want you to believe me when I tell you that people are genuinely worried. People are freaking out.
Europeans.
Yeah, European. This is deeply, deeply worrying and upsetting to people. And, and I want to say it's a level of anxiety that I'm talking about here, because no one can predict the future of what's going to happen. But when you see these statements that are coming out of Greenland or Denmark, when you see the Prime Minister of Denmark going on national television and saying this will be the end of NATO, like, understand that those are not pro forma diplomatic statements, that behind all of that is crisis level worry. And I'm not saying we're going to war, but like in terms of a political crisis, we are like right on the precipice of one. We're kind of in the midst of it. Again, I don't want to be alarmist, but people need to take this really seriously. Certainly our allies are taking it very seriously and are deeply worried. And nobody really knows where this is going to go, because it's really up to one person. It's up to the president. And he is driving a freight train here. And it's not going to be without consequences what he decides to do. I mean, if he just backs down from all of it and the crisis abates, we will still be left in the situation where our European allies know that the president is capable of doing this. And that trust, I think, has irreparably been, I don't want to say it's been broken between the Americans and the Europeans, but it has frayed majorly just in the past year. And that is not going to be easily put back together, including if a Democrat is elected in 2028.
Yeah, very true. Good point to leave it there. I mean, you can't just shake the Etch-a-Sketch.
No.
You can't just press the reset button on your PlayStation and start all over again. This is real stuff.
That's right.
I'm sorry for having you on to talk about this. I really wanted to, when we were talking about this, I really wanted to have you on to talk about your wonderful Iran story, which is just so interesting. I mean, we can always do it again in the future.
Time.
But
that one's not going anywhere. And then Iran is going to be its whole own story we may have to talk about very soon too. So
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we will have you back on in the future. I'm sure you're always welcome here, my friend. Thank you as always.
Thanks, Matt. Good to see you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.